Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the gleaming kitchens and quiet desperation of 1940s America, where the doctors wore white coats, the housewives wore pearls, and everyone was hopped up on pharmaceutical-grade methamphetamine. Not the Breaking Bad kind, the prescription kind. The kind your family physician handed you with a smile and a pat on the back, promising it would cure your sadness, your exhaustion, and your complete lack of enthusiasm for scrubbing the same floor for the 800th time this year. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe hide your Adderall because this story hits a little too close to home. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was like to be a housewife in the 40s when everyone expected you to be perfectly happy in your perfectly clean house with your perfectly behaved children? Did doctors really just hand out speed like candy? What did it feel like to take your pep pill with your morning coffee and suddenly have the energy to vacuum the ceiling? Could you survive a week on the same diet pills that are now banned in 17 countries? Would you last a day in a world where your physician's solution to exhaustion was literally more methamphetamine? Or would you accidentally reorganize your entire neighborhood while experiencing mild cardiac events? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in 1945. You're a housewife. Your husband just left for work. Your children are at school. You're exhausted. You're sad. And you have a bottle of Benzodrine in your purse that your doctor prescribed with a wink. Good luck. Let's set the scene. It's 1945, and you've just survived a world war, but now you're facing an enemy far more relentless than any army, domestic perfection. You wake up at 5:30 a.m., not because you want to, but because breakfast doesn't make itself and your husband expects bacon, eggs, toast, and a smile before he leaves for the office at 7 sharp. Your day is mapped out with military precision, except you're the only soldier and the war never ends. First, there's breakfast, eggs fried in lard, bacon crisped to perfection, coffee percolated just right. Then the children need to be dressed, fed, and sent off to school with lunches you packed while the bacon was frying, and your husband was reading the newspaper without once looking up to acknowledge your existence. Once everyone's gone, the real work begins. The dishes from breakfast need washing. By hand, obviously, because dishwashers are still a luxury most families can't afford. Then there's the laundry, which isn't a matter of tossing clothes in a machine and walking away. No, you're hauling wet, heavy garments through a wringer, hanging them on lines, and praying it doesn't rain because you don't have backup outfits for everyone. The house needs cleaning, floors swept and mopped, rugs beaten, windows washed, furniture dusted, and this isn't a quick once-over. This is hands and knees scrubbing because dirt is a moral failing, and if your neighbor can see dust on your windowsill from across the street, you might as well be a communist. Lunchtime means preparing a meal for yourself, though you'll probably eat standing at the kitchen counter while mentally running through the afternoon's tasks. There's grocery shopping to do, which means walking to multiple stores because one has the best produce, another has the best meat, and another has the best prices. You're hauling bags home on foot or by bus because the car, if your family even has one, is with your husband at work. Then it's time to start thinking about dinner. Something substantial, something impressive, something that shows you've been busy all day, even though the evidence of your labor disappears the moment your family consumes it. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread if you're feeling ambitious or guilty or both. When the children come home, you're expected to be cheerful, attentive, and available, helping with homework, mediating arguments, wiping tears, all while keeping an eye on the stove and making sure nothing burns. Your husband arrives at 6, and you'd better be ready with dinner on the table, lipstick refreshed, and any complaints about your day swallowed down with a smile. After dinner, there are more dishes, baths for the children, bedtime stories, and the quiet evening hours when you finally sit down, except you're mending clothes or ironing or planning tomorrow's meals. Sleep comes sometime after 10, and then you wake up at 5:30 and do it all again. This was the life. This was what women were told to be grateful for. A home, a husband, children, security. But here's what nobody mentioned. It was exhausting, relentlessly, soul-crushingly exhausting. It was the same tasks repeated endlessly with no paycheck, no vacation days, no recognition. Just the expectation that you'd keep going, keep smiling, keep performing perfection. And when you couldn't, when the exhaustion seeped into your bones and the smile felt like it was cracking your face, well, that's when the doctors stepped in with their miracle cure. Here's the thing about being a housewife in the 40s. You weren't allowed to be tired. Exhaustion wasn't a natural response to doing 17 jobs with zero pay and no days off. It was a moral failing, a character flaw, possibly even a mental illness that needed immediate medical intervention, preferably involving pills that made your heart race like you'd just run a marathon. Society had constructed an impossible standard. The ideal housewife was cheerful, energetic, and perpetually available. She woke before everyone else and went to bed after everyone else. She never complained, never snapped, never admitted that scrubbing floors until your knees ached might not be spiritually fulfilling. If you did admit it, if you told your husband you were tired or your mother you were overwhelmed, you were met with confusion or judgment. Tired? From what? You're home all day. That phrase alone probably sent more women to doctors' offices than any actual illness. Because how do you explain that being home all day is exactly what's exhausting? That the isolation, the repetition, the lack of adult conversation, the absence of any work that doesn't immediately get undone, all of it grinds you down until you feel like you're disappearing. Medical journals of the era are fascinating in their complete misunderstanding of the problem. Doctors wrote extensively about housewife syndrome, nervous exhaustion, and neurasthenia, fancy terms for what we'd now recognize as depression, burnout, and the psychological toll of unpaid domestic labor. But instead of questioning the system that demanded women work themselves to death for no recognition, doctors pathologized the women themselves. If you went to your physician complaining of exhaustion, he, and it was almost always a he, would listen sympathetically, then explain that you were suffering from weak nerves, female hysteria, or a constitutional inability to handle the natural duties of your sex. Never mind that those natural duties included the workload of a cook, maid, nanny, tutor, chauffeur, accountant, and therapist, all performed simultaneously with no training and no support. The medical establishment decided that tired women didn't need rest, help, or a fundamental restructuring of domestic labor expectations. They needed treatment. They needed to be fixed so they could continue functioning in a system designed to break them. And what was the treatment? Not therapy. That was too expensive and time-consuming. Not hiring help. That suggested you couldn't manage your own home. Not reducing expectations. That would mean admitting the standards were unrealistic in the first place. No, the treatment was pharmaceutical. Simple, quick, and profitable. A pill you could take every morning that would eliminate your exhaustion, boost your mood, and give you the energy to meet every impossible demand placed on you. A pill that treated the symptom tired women without ever addressing the cause, a society that worked them to death and called it love. Doctors genuinely believed they were helping. They saw women struggling and offered a solution that seemed almost magical. Take this tablet and you'll feel better. You'll have energy. You'll be able to cope. You'll be the wife and mother everyone expects you to be. What they didn't mention, or perhaps didn't yet understand, was that they were prescribing methamphetamine. They were taking women who were exhausted from overwork and giving them powerful stimulants that masked the exhaustion while adding addiction, anxiety, and a host of physical health problems to the mix. Tired wasn't a disease. Tired was the rational response to an irrational situation. But in the 1940s, it was easier to medicate women than to question why they were so exhausted in the first place. And so the pills flowed freely, prescribed with a smile and a pat on the hand, while the real problem, the crushing expectations of domestic perfection, remained completely unaddressed. In 1937, Smith, Klein, and French introduced Benzedrine, an innocent-looking little tablet that promised to cure everything from depression to obesity to that vague sense of existential dread that came from washing the same dishes every single day for eternity. What was in it? Oh, just amphetamine. Pure, pharmaceutical-grade speed marketed to housewives as casually as aspirin. Benzedrine didn't start as a pill. It actually began life as an inhaler designed to treat nasal congestion and asthma. The Benzedrine inhaler hit the market in 1932, and it was a perfectly legitimate medication, a tube containing a strip of paper soaked in amphetamine that you'd crack open and sniff when your sinuses were clogged. Revolutionary? Sure. But people quickly discovered something interesting. If you cracked open that inhaler and ate the strip inside, you got a powerful high. By the mid-30s, college students were buying Benzedrine inhalers by the dozen, breaking them open, and consuming the amphetamine-soaked strips to stay awake during exam periods. Truck drivers used them to power through long-haul routes. Factory workers took them to handle double shifts. And housewives? They discovered that a little Benzedrine could transform an exhausting day into something manageable, even enjoyable. Smith, Klein, and French, being astute business people, noticed this trend and thought, why make people work for it? In 1937, they released Benzedrine sulfate tablets, prescription amphetamine in convenient pill form. The marketing was genius. They didn't advertise it as speed or as a drug that would make your heart race and your hands shake. They called it a treatment for depression, obesity, narcolepsy, and something wonderfully vague called lack of energy. The medical community embraced it immediately. Here was a drug that seemed to solve everything. Patients who were depressed suddenly felt happy. Patients who were overweight lost their appetites and shed pounds. Patients who were exhausted suddenly had energy to spare. It seemed too good to be true, which should have been everyone's first clue that it absolutely was too good to be true. Doctors began prescribing Benzedrine for an astonishing range of conditions. Feeling sad? Benzedrine. Can't lose weight? Benzedrine. Tired all the time? Benzedrine. Having trouble concentrating? Benzedrine. Lacking motivation? You guessed it, Benzedrine. The drug became a cure-all, a pharmaceutical Swiss Army knife that doctors wielded against any complaint that didn't have an obvious physical cause. For housewives specifically, Benzedrine was marketed as a solution to their special problems. Advertisements in medical journals showed tired-looking women transformed into energetic homemakers after taking the medication. The message was clear. If you're struggling to keep up with the demands of domestic life, there's a pill for that. What made Benzedrine particularly insidious was how it was framed. This wasn't presented as a drug to get high or to artificially boost your energy. It was medicine. It came from a pharmacy, prescribed by a doctor, manufactured by a reputable company. It arrived in a proper medicine bottle with typed instructions. Everything about it screamed legitimacy, safety, respectability. The pills themselves were small, white, and unremarkable. Easy to swallow with your morning coffee. Easy to hide in your purse. Easy to take without anyone knowing. There was no stigma attached because it was medication, not recreation. You weren't getting high, you were treating a medical condition. You weren't popping pills, you were taking your prescription, and it worked. Oh, it worked beautifully. That first dose of Benzedrine would hit like sunrise after a long night. Suddenly, the exhaustion lifted. The fog cleared. You had energy, real, tangible energy, that made you feel like you could accomplish anything. The dishes didn't seem daunting anymore. The laundry felt manageable. That dinner party you'd been dreading? Bring it on. You could handle it all. This was the wonder drug. This was the miracle cure. This was the pharmaceutical solution to the problem of being a woman in 1940s America. And millions of women were about to discover exactly what that miracle would cost them. Forget back-alley transactions and shady characters in trench coats. In the 40s, your drug dealer wore a stethoscope, had a medical degree from a prestigious university, and genuinely believed he was helping you by prescribing methamphetamine for your nervous exhaustion, which was medical code for "you're a woman who dared to express human emotions." The relationship between doctors and their female patients in this era was a strange mix of paternalism, genuine concern, and profound misunderstanding. When you walked into your physician's office complaining of exhaustion, depression, or inability to cope, he listened. But he listened through the filter of his training, which told him that women were naturally more emotional, more fragile, more prone to nervous conditions than men. Your appointment would go something like this. You'd sit in the examination room, perhaps twisting a handkerchief in your lap, trying to explain that you're just so tired all the time, that you can't seem to summon the energy to do everything that's expected of you, that sometimes you feel like crying for no reason, or that you've lost interest in things that used to bring you joy. The doctor would nod sympathetically. He'd check your blood pressure, listen to your heart, perhaps examine your thyroid, finding nothing physically wrong. Because exhaustion from overwork doesn't show up in a physical exam, he'd sit back and deliver his diagnosis with confidence. "Mrs. Johnson, you're suffering from nervous exhaustion. It's quite common in women your age, especially those with the responsibilities of managing a household and raising children. The demands of modern life can be quite taxing on the female constitution." Notice how he never questioned whether those demands were reasonable. He never suggested that maybe expecting one person to do the work of 5 was the problem. Instead, he pathologized your inability to meet impossible standards as a personal failing, a weakness of your nervous system. Then came the prescription. He'd pull out his pad and scribble the name of the medication, Benzedrine, Dexedrine, or one of the other amphetamine preparations flooding the market. The instructions were simple. Take 1 tablet in the morning, possibly another at midday if needed. Return in a month for a follow-up. This will help give you the energy you need to manage your daily tasks, he'd explain, his tone reassuring and paternal. "Many of my patients have found it remarkably effective. You should notice a difference within a few days." What he didn't explain was that you were being prescribed methamphetamine. He probably didn't use that word at all. It was Benzedrine, a registered trademark that sounded medical and safe. The fact that it was chemically similar to the stimulants used by soldiers to stay awake during combat missions somehow never came up in these conversations. Doctors prescribed these medications with shocking casualness. There were no addiction warnings, no discussions of side effects, no mention that you might develop tolerance and need higher doses. No one talked about withdrawal, dependency, or the possibility that the drug treating your exhaustion might eventually make you more exhausted than ever. And why would they? The medical literature of the time was overwhelmingly positive about amphetamines. Studies showed they improved mood, increased energy, aided weight loss, and helped patients function better in their daily lives. The downsides, the addiction, the psychosis, the cardiovascular damage, those would take years to fully understand and acknowledge. Your doctor genuinely believed he was helping you. He saw a patient in distress and offered a solution that seemed to work miracles. When you returned for your follow-up appointment and reported that yes, the medication was wonderful, you had so much more energy, you were getting everything done, that confirmed his decision. He was a good doctor. He'd helped you. If you mentioned trouble sleeping, he might add a prescription for barbiturates to take at night. Trouble with appetite? That was actually a bonus. The Benzedrine would help with that too. Feeling jittery or anxious? Perhaps just reduce the dose slightly. Or take it with food. The prescription pad became a solution to every complaint. And the medications stacked up. Amphetamines for energy, barbiturates for sleep, maybe something else for anxiety. You walked out of his office with a paper bag full of pill bottles, each one promising to fix a different aspect of your life. And the relationship continued, month after month, year after year. You'd return for refills, and your doctor would ask how you were doing. Much better, you'd say, because you had learned that was the correct answer. You didn't mention that you couldn't function without the pills anymore. You didn't admit that some mornings you took an extra tablet just to feel normal. You certainly didn't confess that you'd started cracking open the Benzedrine inhalers your husband used for his allergies because you'd run out of pills 2 days before your appointment. Your doctor, your trusted physician, had become your dealer. And neither of you fully understood what was happening. They called them pep pills, which sounds adorable until you realize they were literally amphetamines strong enough to keep bomber pilots awake during 20-hour missions. But sure, give them to Carol from down the street, so she has enough energy to host bridge club and bake a 7-layer cake on the same afternoon. The term pep pill was marketing genius. It sounded cheerful, harmless, almost wholesome, like something that would put a spring in your step, not something that would rewire your brain's reward system and send your heart rate into dangerous territory. The language mattered because it shaped how people thought about these medications. You weren't taking drugs. You were taking pep pills. You weren't getting high. You were getting peppy. The framing made all the difference, transforming powerful stimulants into something that sounded as innocent as vitamin tablets or a cup of strong coffee. The military had actually paved the way for this revolution. During World War II, both Allied and Axis forces distributed amphetamines to their troops to combat fatigue and boost performance. American bomber crews took Benzedrine to stay alert during long missions over Europe. Tank drivers used it to power through extended operations. Even Hitler himself was receiving daily injections of methamphetamine from his personal physician, though that particular detail wasn't widely known at the time. The military found that amphetamines worked remarkably well for their intended purpose. Soldiers could stay awake longer, react faster, and push through exhaustion that would normally incapacitate them. Of course, there were downsides: paranoia, erratic behavior, crashes, addiction, but in wartime, those seemed like acceptable trade-offs. When the war ended, millions of servicemen returned home, having been exposed to amphetamines. The pharmaceutical companies saw an opportunity. If these drugs could help soldiers win battles, surely they could help ordinary Americans win their own daily battles against fatigue, weight gain, and depression. The pep pill revolution exploded across America in the late 40s and early 50s. Benzedrine led the charge, but it was soon joined by Dexedrine, Dexamyl, and a parade of other amphetamine preparations, each marketed with slightly different claims but all delivering the same basic effect: artificial energy and euphoria. Advertisements appeared everywhere, in medical journals, women's magazines, even mainstream newspapers. The imagery was always similar: tired, downtrodden women transformed into vibrant, energetic homemakers. The before photo showed a slumped, exhausted housewife, surrounded by chores. The after photo showed the same woman standing tall, smiling, somehow managing to dust, cook, and look glamorous simultaneously. The messaging was explicit. Modern life is demanding. You're expected to do it all. If your natural energy isn't enough, There's no shame in getting a little help from medicine. These pills aren't a crutch. They're a tool, like a vacuum cleaner or a washing machine. Just another modern convenience to make your life easier. Doctors wrote prescriptions freely. Pharmacies stocked multiple brands. Women shared recommendations with their friends over coffee. Oh, you're exhausted all the time. Have you tried Benzedrine? My doctor prescribed it for me, and it's been a lifesaver. I actually have the energy to get through the day now. The pills became normalized, integrated into daily routines as unremarkably as breakfast. You'd wake up, make coffee, take your pep pill, and start your day. It was just what you did, like brushing your teeth or putting on lipstick before your husband came home. What made the revolution particularly effective was how it tapped into existing anxieties. Women in the 40s and 50s were bombarded with messages about proper domestic performance. Magazine articles outlined the 17 steps to a perfectly clean home. Television shows depicted cheerful mothers who never seemed tired or frustrated. Advertisements for household products implied that a clean floor or a good meal was the key to a happy marriage. The pressure was immense. And it was everywhere. You couldn't escape it. Every interaction with neighbors, every conversation with your mother or mother-in-law, every glance at a magazine cover reinforced the message. You should be doing more, doing better, being happier about it. Pep pills offered a solution. They let you meet those impossible standards, at least temporarily. You could be the woman in the advertisements. Energetic, cheerful, perfectly coiffed, with a spotless house and a 7-layer cake cooling on the counter. You could be everything everyone expected you to be. The revolution wasn't about getting high. It was about getting by. It was about survival in a system that demanded more than any human could naturally give. And for millions of women, those little pep pills seemed like the answer to a prayer, at least until they weren't. The advertisements were breathtaking in their audacity. Glossy magazine spreads showed smiling housewives practically skipping through their spotless homes, children gleaming, husbands adoring, all thanks to their daily dose of pharmaceutical methamphetamine thoughtfully prescribed by a physician who probably took some himself to get through his 18-hour shifts. The marketing campaigns for amphetamines in the 1940s and 50s were masterclasses in manipulation. They didn't sell drugs, they sold solutions. They didn't promise a high, they promised happiness, energy, and social acceptability. They transformed addiction into aspiration. One typical advertisement showed a well-dressed woman standing in a perfect kitchen, holding a feather duster in one hand and a can of furniture polish in the other. Her hair was immaculate, her lipstick fresh, her smile radiant. The headline read, "When your get up and go has got up and went, Benzedrine brings it back." The ad copy explained that many women suffer from that tired feeling that makes daily tasks seem overwhelming, but that Benzedrine could restore their natural energy and enthusiasm. Another ad targeted weight loss specifically, showing a before and after transformation. The before photo depicted a plump, sad-looking woman staring forlornly at her reflection. The after photo showed a slim, jubilant woman being embraced by her handsome husband. The message: Benzedrine suppresses appetite and helps you achieve the figure you've always wanted, which will obviously solve all your marital and emotional problems. These advertisements appeared in women's magazines nestled between recipes and sewing patterns, making them seem like just another helpful household tip. They also ran in medical journals aimed at physicians. But those ads used different language. Instead of tired mothers, they referenced patients with depression and fatigue. Instead of weight loss, they discussed appetite suppression in obesity. The scientific veneer made doctors feel they were prescribing real medicine, not just handing out legal speed. The pharmaceutical companies were brilliant at understanding their audience. They knew that women in the 40s and 50s were under enormous pressure to maintain perfect homes while looking perfectly groomed and acting perfectly cheerful. They knew these women felt exhausted, overwhelmed, and often isolated. And they positioned amphetamines as the solution to all of it. Some ads didn't even mention the drug name directly. They simply showed an exhausted woman talking to her doctor, who handed her a prescription while saying something reassuring. The next panel showed the same woman transformed, energetic, happy, surrounded by her adoring family. The implication was clear. Your doctor has the answer to your problems, and that answer comes in pill form. The language used in these advertisements is particularly revealing. Women weren't depicted as having a drug problem or needing stimulants to function. They were getting a little help or finding their energy again or taking advantage of modern medicine. The framing made it sound responsible, even virtuous, to take these medications. Some campaigns specifically targeted new mothers, suggesting that Benzodrine could help with post-pregnancy weight loss and the exhaustion of caring for an infant. Never mind that new mothers were exhausted because they were literally awake every 2 hours feeding a baby. The solution wasn't sleep or support, it was amphetamines. Other ads focused on the social consequences of not taking the medication. They showed women missing parties because they were too tired, disappointing their husbands with poorly cooked meals, or losing friends because they couldn't keep up with social obligations. The subtle message: if you don't take this medication, you'll fail as a wife, mother, and friend. The pharmaceutical companies also cultivated relationships with women's magazines, providing content that blurred the line between editorial and advertising. Articles about overcoming fatigue would casually mention that many doctors were prescribing new medications to help women cope with their busy lives. The articles never explicitly said, "Take amphetamines," but they created an environment where asking your doctor for pep pills seemed like a sensible, modern solution. Perhaps most insidiously, the marketing created a sense that there was something wrong with women who couldn't naturally maintain the energy levels demanded of them. If there was a pill that could give you energy, and you weren't taking it, weren't you choosing to be tired? Weren't you choosing to underperform as a wife and mother? The advertisements sold more than medication. They sold the idea that pharmaceutical intervention was normal, necessary, and even virtuous. They transformed exhaustion from a reasonable response to unreasonable demands into a medical condition requiring treatment. And they did it with such polish, such confidence, such appeal to women's deepest fears and desires that millions of women looked at those ads and saw themselves and reached for the prescription pad, feeling sad, exhausted, overwhelmed by the crushing weight of societal expectations and the complete lack of personal autonomy. Congratulations! You had depression, which in the 40s was treated not with therapy or support or maybe questioning why women were so miserable, but with drugs that made you clean faster while your heart tried to escape your chest. Depression in the 1940s was poorly understood, heavily stigmatized, and almost exclusively blamed on the person experiencing it rather than their circumstances. The prevailing medical opinion was that depression, especially in women, stemmed from some kind of constitutional weakness, a failure of character, a defect in emotional regulation, or an imbalance in the mysterious nervous system that doctors referenced constantly but couldn't quite explain. When a woman walked into her doctor's office and admitted she felt sad all the time, that she cried for no apparent reason, that she'd lost interest in her children or her marriage or her life, the doctor rarely asked why. He didn't inquire about her workload, her isolation, her lack of sleep, or whether anyone had asked her what she wanted from life. Those questions weren't part of the diagnostic process. Instead, the doctor would explain that she was suffering from depression, which was viewed as a disease of the mind that could be treated with medication. The fact that her sadness might be a completely rational response to living a life of unending domestic labor with no recognition, no pay, and no escape never seemed to occur to anyone. The diagnostic criteria were laughably vague. If you seemed sad, you were depressed. If you cried easily, you were depressed. If you admitted you felt overwhelmed or couldn't keep up with household demands, you were depressed. If you suggested that maybe the problem wasn't you, but rather the expectation that one person could do 17 jobs simultaneously while maintaining a perfect appearance and cheerful demeanor, you were definitely depressed and possibly delusional. Once diagnosed, the treatment was straightforward: amphetamines, Benzedrine, Dexedrine, or one of the other mood-elevating medications that pharmaceutical companies marketed specifically for depression. The logic was simple. If depression made you feel sad and lethargic, then a drug that made you feel happy and energetic must be the cure. And in the short term, it worked. That's the truly tragic part. Amphetamines do elevate mood. At least initially, they flood your brain with dopamine and norepinephrine, the same neurotransmitters that make you feel good when something genuinely positive happens. Taking Benzedrine for depression was like borrowing happiness from tomorrow. It felt wonderful in the moment, but came with interest rates that would destroy you. Women who'd been dragging themselves through their days suddenly felt alive again. The grey fog lifted. Colours seemed brighter. Tasks that had felt impossible now seemed manageable, even enjoyable. They had energy to play with their children, patience for their husbands, enthusiasm for their housework. They felt like themselves again, or maybe like a better version of themselves. Doctors saw this transformation and congratulated themselves on successful treatment. The patient came in depressed and left happy. What more could you ask for? The fact that the happiness was chemically induced and came with a growing list of side effects didn't diminish the apparent success. What nobody acknowledged was that the amphetamines weren't treating depression, they were masking it. The underlying causes remained completely unaddressed. The woman was still isolated, still overworked, still trapped in a life she hadn't chosen and couldn't escape. But now she had a pill that made her not care as much, that gave her the artificial energy to keep performing, to keep smiling, to keep pretending everything was fine. The medical establishment never connected the dots between women's widespread depression and their actual living conditions. They never wondered why housewives were so much more likely to be diagnosed with depression than men. They never questioned whether a system that left women exhausted, isolated, and unfulfilled might be contributing to their mental health struggles. Instead, they pathologized the women. Depression became a personal failing, a medical condition, a problem located within the woman's own mind and body rather than in the society around her. And the solution was always pharmaceutical, a pill to fix the woman, so she could continue functioning in a system designed to break her. The truly dark irony is that amphetamines can actually cause depression, especially during withdrawal and long-term use. So women would take Benzedrine for their depression, develop tolerance, need higher doses, eventually experience the crash and withdrawal that came with dependency, feel more depressed than ever, and return to their doctors for higher doses or additional medications. It was a perfect cycle of medicalization. Create impossible standards. Pathologize women's natural response to those standards. Prescribe medications that temporarily mask the problem while creating new ones, then prescribe more medications to address the side effects. And through it all, never once question whether the standards themselves might be the issue. Depression wasn't the disease. The disease was a society that crushed women's spirits and then sold them pills to cope with the crushing. One of Benzedrine's most popular uses was as a diet pill, because naturally, if you're going to be miserable, you should at least be thin while doing it. Doctors prescribed amphetamines to help women lose weight, which worked great until patients realized they'd also lost their appetite for sleep, food, and sanity. The connection between amphetamines and weight loss was discovered almost accidentally. Early users of Benzedrine noticed that the drug suppressed their appetite dramatically. Food became uninteresting, almost repulsive. Patients taking the medication for depression or fatigue would mention to their doctors that they'd lost weight, and the doctor's eyes would light up with entrepreneurial glee. Weight loss in the 1940s and 50s was an obsession, particularly for women. The beauty standards of the era demanded a specific silhouette. Trim waist, modest curves, everything pulled in and controlled. Being overweight wasn't just considered unattractive, it was viewed as a moral failing, evidence of laziness or lack of self-control. Women's magazines ran endless articles about diet and exercise, each one promising the secret to achieving the perfect figure. Pharmaceutical companies saw an opportunity. If benzodrine suppressed appetite, why not market it specifically for weight loss? The advertisements were brilliant in their manipulation. They showed plump women looking miserable and lonely, then showed the same women slim, radiant, and surrounded by male attention. The message was clear: thin equals happy, and benzodrine equals thin, therefore benzodrine equals happy. Doctors prescribed amphetamines for weight loss with remarkable enthusiasm. If a woman mentioned wanting to lose a few pounds, out came the prescription pad. No discussion of diet or exercise, no questions about eating habits or lifestyle, just a bottle of pills and instructions to take one before each meal. The weight loss was dramatic and immediate. Amphetamines don't just suppress appetite. They rev up your metabolism and make your body burn through calories at an accelerated rate. Women would drop 10, 15, 20 pounds in a matter of weeks. Their clothes would hang loose, their cheekbones would emerge, and everyone would compliment them on how wonderful they looked. What nobody mentioned was that the weight loss came with a price. First, there was the appetite suppression itself, which wasn't subtle. Women taking benzodrine for weight loss would sit down to family dinners and struggle to swallow even a few bites. Food tasted like cardboard, or worse, actively disgusting. The smell of cooking would turn their stomachs. This created its own set of problems. How do you cook meals for your family when food makes you nauseous? How do you sit through Sunday dinner at your mother-in-law's house when the sight of her pot roast makes you want to vomit? Women would push food around their plates, claim they'd eaten a big lunch, make excuses about upset stomachs. Then there was the energy expenditure. Amphetamines don't just make you less hungry, they make you unable to sit still. Women on diet pills would clean their houses top to bottom 3 times a day, reorganize closets at midnight, walk aimlessly around their neighborhoods because sitting felt impossible. The weight melted off, sure, but it was being burned away by artificial, unsustainable activity. The physical effects were even more concerning. Heart palpitations, high blood pressure, sweating, tremors, insomnia, all common side effects of amphetamine use, all dismissed by doctors as minor inconveniences worth enduring for the sake of weight loss. Women would mention that their hearts were racing or their hands wouldn't stop shaking, and doctors would say, "That's normal, it means the medication is working." And then there was tolerance. After a few weeks on the same dose, the appetite suppression would fade. Food would start seeming appealing again, and the weight would creep back. Women would return to their doctors panicking about regaining the weight, and the doctors would simply increase the dose. More pills, more often, chasing the same effect that had come so easily at first. Some women were prescribed amphetamines for weight loss and stayed on them for years, decades even. They'd start at 1 pill a day and eventually be taking 4 or 5, their tolerance so high that they needed massive doses just to feel normal. Their weight would fluctuate wildly, dropping dramatically when they increased the dose, bouncing back during attempts to quit, plummeting again when they gave up and returned to the pills. The real tragedy was that the weight loss was never the point. The advertisements and the doctors framed it as health and beauty. But what they were really selling was control. In a life where women controlled almost nothing, not their time, not their money, not their bodies, weight became one of the few things they could manipulate. And if manipulating it required pharmaceutical intervention, well, that was just modern medicine. The diet pills didn't make women thin, they made women addicted. But at least they were thin addicts. And in the 1940s, that was considered a win. While the Rolling Stones wouldn't sing about Mother's Little Helper until the 60s, the phenomenon started much earlier with amphetamines. These pills became the secret weapon of suburban domesticity, the thing that helped you smile through the exhaustion, the boredom, the quiet desperation of a life spent in service to others with no recognition, no pay, and definitely no lunch break. The pills became integrated into daily routines so seamlessly that they stopped seeming like drugs at all. They were just part of the morning ritual, like brushing your teeth or making breakfast. You'd wake up, splash water on your face, swallow your Benzedrine with a glass of water, and wait for the familiar rush of energy that would carry you through the day. Within 20 minutes, the fatigue would lift, your mind would sharpen. The day's tasks, making breakfast, packing lunches, cleaning, shopping, cooking dinner, would stop seeming like an insurmountable mountain and start seeming like a manageable list. You could do this, you could handle it. You could be the perfect housewife everyone expected you to be. The pills became a secret shared among women, though rarely discussed openly. You'd be at a coffee morning with neighbors, and someone would mention how exhausted she'd been feeling. Another woman might say, quietly, "Have you talked to Dr. Harrison? He prescribed something for me that's been really helpful. No brand names, no explicit drug talk, just a knowing glance and a doctor's name passed along like a recipe for pot roast." In some social circles, taking pep pills was so common it was almost expected. If you mentioned being tired and someone asked if you were taking anything for it, answering no would get you pitying looks and unsolicited advice. You really should talk to your doctor. There's no reason to suffer when there's help available. The language around the pills was always carefully sanitized. They weren't drugs, they were medication. You weren't getting high, you were treating a condition. You weren't addicted, you were managing your health. The linguistic gymnastics allowed women to maintain the fiction that they were doing something respectable and medical rather than developing a substance dependency. For many women, the pills became non-negotiable. They structured their entire day around that morning dose. If they ran out early or couldn't get to the pharmacy, panic would set in. How would they manage without it? How would they get through the day? The thought of facing their responsibilities without pharmaceutical assistance felt impossible. Some women kept their pill use secret, even from their husbands. They'd take the pills in the bathroom or kitchen, swallow them quickly, hide the bottle in a drawer or purse. It wasn't shame exactly, more a sense that their husbands wouldn't understand, or worse, would judge them for needing help to do what was supposed to come naturally. Other women's husbands knew and approved. After all, the pills made their wives more energetic, more pleasant, more sexually available. A husband whose wife was too exhausted for marital relations might encourage her to see a doctor about her fatigue, knowing full well that the doctor would prescribe amphetamines that would solve his problem even if they created new ones for her. The pills also enabled a kind of performance that would have been impossible otherwise. Women could throw elaborate dinner parties, maintain spotless homes, volunteer at their children's schools, participate in community organizations, and still have energy left over to be charming and attentive to their husbands. They became super homemakers, capable of doing it all. And the pills were their secret. But there was a darkness underneath all that artificial energy. The pills didn't eliminate the exhaustion. They just covered it up. Underneath the chemical buzz was a bone-deep tiredness that kept accumulating day after day, week after week. The pills borrowed energy from a bank account that was already overdrawn. Women would notice that they needed the pills earlier in the day, or that one pill wasn't enough anymore. They'd start taking an extra half pill at lunch, then a full pill in the afternoon, then maybe another in the evening to get through dinner and bedtime routines. The doses crept up so gradually that it was easy to miss the progression from therapeutic use to dependency, and the pills changed personality in subtle ways. Women became more intense, more focused, more driven. They'd tackle projects with manic energy, scrubbing floors that didn't need scrubbing, reorganizing closets that were already organized, cooking elaborate meals that nobody asked for. The pills didn't just give energy, they created a compulsion to use that energy, to move, to do, to achieve. But underneath it all was the same woman, the same exhaustion, the same quiet desperation. The pills didn't solve anything fundamental. They just made it possible to keep going, to keep performing, to keep pretending that everything was fine. They were mother's little helper. And they helped her do one thing: survive in a system designed to destroy her. One cheerful, energetic, artificially sustained day at a time. So what happened when you took your doctor-prescribed methamphetamine at 8 a.m.? At first, absolutely nothing. And then, suddenly everything. Your exhaustion evaporated. Your sadness lifted. The fog cleared. You had energy. So much energy that you reorganized the linen closet, scrubbed the baseboards, baked 3 pies, and still had enough left over to alphabetize your spice rack. The first time you took Benzedrine was unlike anything you'd experienced before. You'd swallow the small white tablet with your morning coffee. Maybe a little nervous about what would happen. Maybe skeptical that a pill could really make a difference. Then you'd go about starting your day, clearing the breakfast dishes, getting the children ready. About 20 minutes in, you'd notice something. The heaviness that usually dragged at your limbs would start to lift. It was subtle at first, like someone had turned up the brightness in the room slightly. Colors seemed more vivid. Sounds became clearer. Your thoughts, which usually moved through molasses, suddenly flowed freely. Then the energy would hit. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone had flipped a switch inside you. Suddenly, you weren't just awake. You were alert, focused, capable. That mountain of dishes in the sink? No problem. You'd tackle them with enthusiasm. Your hands moving efficiently, your mind already planning the next task and the one after that. The exhaustion you'd been carrying for months or years simply vanished. In its place was a sense of capability, of power, of finally being able to handle everything that was expected of you. You'd look at your to-do list, make beds, do laundry, vacuum, dust, prepare lunch, go shopping, start dinner. And instead of feeling overwhelmed, you'd feel energized. You could do this. You could do all of this. Your mood would elevate too. The grey depression that had been clouding everything would lift. And suddenly life seemed brighter, more manageable, even enjoyable. You'd find yourself humming while you cleaned, chatting cheerfully with the mailman, actually smiling when your children came home from school instead of mustering fake enthusiasm through gritted teeth. The physical sensation was distinctive. Your heart would beat faster, stronger. You could feel it pounding in your chest, a steady rhythm that felt powerful rather than frightening. Your body temperature would rise slightly. You might feel warm, break a light sweat even when you weren't exerting yourself. Your hands might tremble slightly, but it felt like excitement, like potential energy waiting to be used. Food became irrelevant. The thought of eating seemed pointless, almost repulsive. Your stomach would feel tight, closed off. You'd make lunch for your children and realize hours later that you'd forgotten to eat anything yourself, and you wouldn't even care. The absence of hunger felt liberating, like you'd been freed from one more mundane need. Time would behave strangely. Hours would pass in what felt like minutes. You'd start cleaning the kitchen at 9 a.m. and suddenly look up to find it was 2 in the afternoon, and you'd also cleaned the bathrooms, done 3 loads of laundry, and reorganized the pantry. The speed at which you could accomplish tasks felt almost superhuman. Your mind would race too. Thoughts would come faster. Connections would form more readily. You'd have ideas about how to rearrange the furniture, about what to cook for dinner, about projects you could tackle, improvements you could make. Your mental clarity was sharp, focused, like looking through a camera lens that had finally been brought into perfect focus. Conversations became easier. You'd chat with neighbors over the fence and actually have the energy to be charming and engaged rather than just politely nodding while internally screaming. Your children would tell you about their day, and you'd listen, really listen, and respond with genuine interest rather than exhausted half attention. Everything felt possible. That dinner party you'd been dreading? Bring it on. You could prepare a 5-course meal, set a beautiful table, and be a gracious, energetic hostess. That pile of mending you'd been avoiding for weeks? You could tackle it right now and probably finish it before lunch. But underneath the euphoria, there were signs of something darker. Your jaw would clench unconsciously. You'd grind your teeth without realizing it. Your hands would shake slightly when you tried to thread a needle or write a letter. You'd feel your heart racing and tell yourself it was just the excitement of finally having energy. At night, when the pill wore off, the crash would come. Suddenly, all that energy would drain away, leaving you more exhausted than before. But you'd remember how good the morning had felt, how capable you'd been, how much you'd accomplished, and you'd think, just one pill. One pill every morning. Surely that's fine. Surely that's not a problem. The next morning, you'd reach for the bottle again. But here's what the doctors didn't mention in their cheerful prescriptions. Methamphetamine doesn't actually cure depression or exhaustion. It just masks it with artificial energy and chemical euphoria while your body burns through resources it doesn't have, like a car running on fumes and broken dreams. The initial euphoria and energy of amphetamines was real, but it came with a cost that nobody explained up front. Your body wasn't creating new energy. It was spending energy reserves at an accelerated rate, like maxing out a credit card with no plan to pay it back. Every task you accomplished while on benzodrine was being done with borrowed vitality. Your brain's reward system started changing almost immediately. Amphetamines flood your neural pathways with dopamine, the feel-good chemical that's supposed to reward you for actually accomplishing something meaningful. But when you take amphetamines, you get the dopamine rush without doing anything to earn it. Your brain starts to recalibrate, deciding that the normal dopamine levels from actual accomplishments aren't enough anymore. This meant that activities that used to bring you genuine pleasure, playing with your children, reading a book, having a conversation with a friend, started feeling flat and unrewarding. Nothing could compete with the pharmaceutical high. Real life became dull by comparison, like watching a black and white television after experiencing color. The physical toll began accumulating silently. Your heart was working overtime, beating faster and harder for hours every day. Blood pressure crept up. The cardiovascular system wasn't designed to operate at peak intensity for 12 hours straight. But that's exactly what amphetamines demanded. Some women developed heart palpitations, irregular, frightening beats that felt like their hearts were skipping or fluttering. Sleep became increasingly difficult. Even when the pills wore off in the evening, your nervous system remained overstimulated. You'd lie in bed, exhausted but unable to sink into sleep. Your mind still racing, your body still twitchy with residual energy. This led many doctors to prescribe barbiturates or other sedatives to help you rest, creating a dangerous cycle of uppers during the day and downers at night. Your appetite suppression started causing real nutritional deficits. Sure, you'd lost weight, but you'd also lost the vitamins, minerals, and calories your body needed to function. Women on long-term amphetamine use would develop deficiencies that manifested as brittle nails, thinning hair, pale complexion, and constant minor illnesses as their immune systems struggled. The mental effects were perhaps even more concerning. Anxiety became a constant companion. That racing heart and those trembling hands weren't just physical, they came with a psychological component. You'd feel keyed up, on edge, like something terrible was about to happen. Small problems would feel catastrophic. Your children being too loud would set your teeth on edge. Your husband being late for dinner would trigger disproportionate panic. Some women developed paranoia. They'd become convinced that neighbors were judging them, that their husbands were having affairs, that everyone could tell they were taking pills. They'd obsessively check and recheck things. Did I lock the door? Did I turn off the stove? Is someone watching me? The line between reasonable caution and irrational fear became increasingly blurred. Irritability spiked dramatically. The patience and cheerfulness that the pills initially provided would flip into its opposite. You'd snap at your children over trivial things. You'd feel rage bubbling just beneath the surface, ready to explode at the slightest provocation. Your family would learn to tread carefully around you, never quite sure which version of you they'd encounter. The crashes between doses became more severe. When the pill wore off, you wouldn't just return to your baseline exhaustion, you'd plummet below it. Depression would wash over you in waves. Everything would seem hopeless, overwhelming, impossible. The only thing that made it better was taking another pill, which of course was exactly the problem. Your body developed tolerance frighteningly quickly. The dose that had worked miracles in week 1 would barely make a dent by week 4. You'd find yourself taking pills earlier in the day, adding extra half doses, counting down the hours until you could justifiably take another. The line between therapeutic use and addiction wasn't just blurred, it was completely invisible. Withdrawal, even brief withdrawal between doses, brought its own horrors. If you ran out of pills and couldn't get to the pharmacy immediately, you'd experience crushing fatigue, depression, irritability, and intense drug cravings. Your body had adapted to operating on amphetamines, and without them, it barely functioned. Some women experienced more severe psychiatric effects, hallucinations, delusions, full psychotic breaks. They'd see things that weren't there, believe impossible things, lose touch with reality. Most doctors blamed the underlying mental illness rather than the medication they'd prescribed. And the treatment was often more medication or hospitalization. The pharmaceutical bliss wasn't bliss at all. It was a trap, baited with energy and euphoria, that slowly destroyed your body, rewired your brain, and left you dependent on the very thing that was harming you. But by the time you realized it, you were already caught. One of the first things to go when you're taking daily amphetamines is sleep, which creates a beautiful, vicious cycle. You're exhausted, so you take speed, which makes you unable to sleep, which makes you more exhausted, which makes you need more speed, and before you know it, you haven't slept in 3 days, but you've somehow deep-cleaned the entire neighborhood. Sleep and amphetamines are fundamentally incompatible. The drug's entire purpose is to stimulate your central nervous system, to keep you alert and energized. Sleep requires the opposite, a gradual wind-down, a quieting of neural activity, a release into unconsciousness. Taking amphetamines and expecting to sleep normally is like drinking espresso and expecting to take a nap. At first, the sleep disruption seemed manageable. You'd take your pill at 8 a.m., it would wear off by evening, and you'd go to bed at your normal time. Maybe it took a little longer to fall asleep. Maybe you were slightly more restless, but nothing catastrophic. You told yourself it was fine, but your body doesn't reset overnight. The amphetamines might metabolize, but your nervous system remained overstimulated. Your brain chemistry had been flooded with artificial neurotransmitters all day, and it needed time to recalibrate. Sleep became lighter, less restorative. You'd toss and turn, wake frequently, have vivid, disturbing dreams. Then you'd wake up in the morning even more tired than before you'd started taking the pills. This was the trap. The medication that was supposed to give you energy was actually depleting you, creating a deficit that could only be filled with more medication. So you'd take your morning dose, feel better temporarily, then crash harder that night. Women started taking their pills earlier and earlier, trying to ensure they'd wear off before bedtime. 7 a.m. became 6:30, then 6, then 5:30. Some women would wake up, take a pill, then go back to bed for half an hour. hoping the medication would kick in just as they needed to start their day. But earlier doses meant earlier crashes. By late afternoon, you'd feel the energy draining away, the exhaustion creeping back. The temptation to take another pill was enormous. Just a half dose, you'd tell yourself. Just to get through making dinner and the evening routine. You'd swallow the extra pill at 4 p.m., then find yourself wide awake at midnight, staring at the ceiling while your husband snored beside you. The sleep deprivation itself created new problems. Without adequate rest, your cognitive function declined. You'd forget things, where you'd put the car keys, whether you'd turned off the stove, what your children had told you about their plans after school. You'd make mistakes, oversalt the soup, miss appointments, snap at people without meaning to. Your appearance suffered. Dark circles appeared under your eyes, no matter how much makeup you applied. Your skin looked dull, your eyes bloodshot. Friends would ask if you were feeling all right, and you'd force a smile and say you'd just been busy, while internally screaming that you hadn't truly slept in weeks. Some women resorted to alcohol to help them sleep. A glass of wine at dinner, then 2 glasses, then 3. The alcohol would help you fall asleep but would also interfere with sleep quality, leaving you even more tired in the morning, which meant you needed more amphetamines, which meant you needed more alcohol, in an ever-escalating spiral. Others went to their doctors complaining about insomnia. The doctors, often unaware of how much their patients were struggling with the amphetamines they'd already prescribed, would add barbiturates or other sedatives to the mix. Now you had uppers in the morning and downers at night, your body constantly being chemically pushed and pulled in opposite directions. The barbiturates came with their own set of problems. They were highly addictive, caused cognitive impairment, and created dangerous interactions with alcohol. Women who took both amphetamines and barbiturates daily were essentially riding a pharmaceutical seesaw, their bodies never finding equilibrium, always being forced into artificial states. Sleep deprivation has serious health consequences. Your immune system weakens, making you more susceptible to illness. Your emotional regulation suffers, leading to mood swings and irritability. Your judgment becomes impaired. Chronic sleep loss is linked to high blood pressure, heart disease, and cognitive decline. But in the 1940s and 50s, these long-term consequences weren't well understood or discussed. You'd go to your doctor complaining that you couldn't sleep, and he'd prescribe sleeping pills without ever questioning whether the amphetamines he'd prescribed for your exhaustion might be causing the insomnia. The solution to medication-induced problems was always more medication. Some women gave up on sleep entirely. They'd exist in a strange twilight state, never fully rested, never fully awake, just constantly moving through their days in a pharmaceutical haze. They'd measure their nights not in hours of sleep, but in hours of lying in bed with their eyes closed, hoping for rest that never quite came. The irony was devastating. You'd started taking amphetamines because you were exhausted. Now you were taking amphetamines, unable to sleep, and more exhausted than ever. But you couldn't stop taking them because without them, you couldn't function at all. The trap had closed completely. After a few weeks of regular amphetamine use, something else started happening. Something the doctors called nervousness, but was actually paranoia, anxiety, and the creeping sensation that everyone was watching you, judging you, noticing that your hands were shaking and you hadn't blinked in 45 minutes. Paranoia is a well-documented effect of amphetamine use, but in the 40s and 50s, it was rarely attributed to the medication itself. Instead, it was seen as evidence of the underlying mental illness that the amphetamines were supposedly treating. If you went to your doctor complaining of paranoid thoughts, he'd nod sympathetically and perhaps adjust your medication, usually by adding something for anxiety rather than removing the amphetamines causing it. The paranoia would start subtly. You'd notice yourself paying attention to things that didn't really matter. Did that neighbor look at you strangely when you said hello? Was she judging your appearance? Had you forgotten to put on lipstick? Was your house not as clean as hers? These thoughts, which might normally pass through your mind briefly, would stick and amplify. You'd find yourself dwelling on them, turning them over repeatedly, building elaborate narratives about what people were thinking about you. That glance from your neighbor became evidence that she'd noticed something wrong with you. She probably told the other neighbors. They were probably all talking about you. The physical symptoms of amphetamine use, the trembling hands, the dilated pupils, the rapid speech, the weight loss, made you feel exposed and vulnerable. You became convinced that everyone could tell you were taking pills. Every interaction became a performance where you tried to appear normal while internally panicking that your cover was blown. Social situations became exhausting. At coffee mornings with neighbors or church socials or school events, you'd be hyper-aware of every word you said, every gesture you made. Were you talking too fast? Too much? Did that comment come out wrong? Were people looking at you strangely? You'd go home and replay every conversation obsessively, finding evidence of judgment and rejection in perfectly innocent exchanges. Your relationship with your husband could become poisoned by paranoia. You'd start noticing things that had always been there but now seemed suspicious. He came home late from work. Was he having an affair? He seemed distracted at dinner. Was he unhappy with you? He complimented another woman at a party. Did he wish he'd married her instead? These thoughts would spiral. You'd find yourself checking his pockets, sniffing his shirts for perfume, calling his office to verify his whereabouts. The rational part of your brain knew you were being ridiculous. But the paranoia was stronger than reason. It felt true, even when you knew it wasn't. Some women developed paranoia about their children. Were they being bullied at school and not telling you? Were they secretly unhappy? Did they resent you? You'd interrogate them about their days, looking for hidden meanings in their answers, reading rejection and criticism into normal childhood behavior. The paranoia extended to your own body. Every physical sensation became a potential catastrophe. Heart palpitations meant you were having a heart attack. A headache meant you had a brain tumor. Dizziness meant you were dying. You'd become hypervigilant about your health, constantly monitoring your body for signs of disaster. Doctor visits became fraught with anxiety. You'd worry that the doctor could tell you were taking too many pills, that he'd judge you, cut you off, report you somehow, so you'd lie, minimize how many pills you were taking, how often you were taking them, how much you needed them. You'd doctor shop, getting prescriptions from multiple physicians so no one would know the full extent of your use. The paranoia could escalate into full-blown delusions. Some women became convinced that people were plotting against them, that their food was being poisoned, that they were being followed or watched. These weren't brief, paranoid thoughts. They were fixed, unshakable beliefs that dominated their thinking and behavior. In severe cases, women experienced what's called amphetamine psychosis, a state indistinguishable from schizophrenia, involving hallucinations, delusions, and complete breaks from reality. They'd see people who weren't there, hear voices, believe impossible things. Most doctors, unfamiliar with the psychiatric effects of long-term amphetamine use, would diagnose them with mental illness and prescribe additional medications or recommend hospitalization. The tragedy was that in many cases, simply stopping the amphetamines would have resolved the paranoia and psychotic symptoms. But nobody made that connection. The drugs were medicine, prescribed by doctors, manufactured by reputable companies. They couldn't be causing these problems. The problems must be coming from the patient herself, from her weak nerves, her female constitution, her underlying mental instability. So women would continue taking the medications that were making them paranoid, while also taking additional medications to treat the paranoia, while the real cause of their suffering went unrecognized and unaddressed. The paranoia wasn't a symptom of mental illness. It was a symptom of methamphetamine toxicity. But nobody was ready to admit that yet. Developed tolerance to your current dose of methamphetamine? No problem. Your friendly neighborhood physician would simply prescribe more, because clearly the solution to drug dependency was just more drugs, preferably taken more frequently, possibly with a side of barbiturates to help you sleep at night after the speed wore off. Tolerance is the body's natural response to repeated exposure to a drug. Your neural pathways adapt, your receptors downregulate, and you need increasingly larger doses to achieve the same effect. It's a well-understood pharmacological principle, but in the 1940s and 50s, doctors either didn't recognize it or didn't care. The pattern was predictable and devastating. You'd start on one 5 milligram benzodrine tablet per day. It would work beautifully for a few weeks. Energy, mood elevation, appetite suppression, all the promised benefits. Then gradually, almost imperceptibly, the effects would begin to fade. At first, you'd tell yourself you were imagining it. The pills were still working. You were just having a bad day. But the bad days would multiply. You'd wake up, take your pill, and wait for the familiar rush of energy that never quite came. You'd feel something, sure, but it was muted, weak, disappointing. So, you'd return to your doctor and explain that the medication wasn't working as well anymore. Most doctors had a standard response. They'd increase the dose. Instead of one 5 milligram tablet, take 2, or switch to 10 milligram tablets, or take one in the morning and another at lunch. The increased dose would work for a while. That wonderful energy would return, the fog would lift, and you'd feel capable again. You'd think, this is perfect, this is the right dose. This will work long term, and it would, until it didn't. The cycle would repeat every few weeks or months. The dose that had seemed perfect would stop being enough. You'd return to the doctor. He'd increase it again. 2 tablets became 3, then 4. Morning doses were supplemented with afternoon doses. 5 milligram tablets were replaced with 10 milligram, then 15, then 20. Some women ended up taking doses that would have been considered dangerous or even lethal when they first started. They'd be consuming 50, 75, even 100 milligrams of amphetamines per day, doses that would send a first-time user to the hospital with heart palpitations and severe anxiety. But their tolerance was so high that they needed these massive amounts just to feel normal. The doctors facilitating this escalation weren't monsters. Most genuinely believed they were helping. They'd been trained to view patient comfort and function as the primary goals. If a patient said the medication wasn't working, increasing the dose seemed like the logical solution. The concept of dependency and tolerance existed, but it wasn't applied to therapeutic use of prescription medications. Pharmaceutical companies didn't help. Their marketing materials suggested that amphetamines were safe for long-term use and could be adjusted as needed to maintain effectiveness. They never mentioned that adjusting as needed would inevitably lead to dangerous dependency. Some doctors did become concerned when their patients started requesting higher and higher doses. They'd try to set limits. I can't prescribe more than X milligrams per day, which would lead women to doctor shop, getting prescriptions from multiple physicians and pharmacies so no single doctor would know how much they were really taking. The medical appointments became exercises in deception. You'd downplay how much you were taking while emphasizing how much you still needed the medication. You'd describe your exhaustion and depression in vivid detail to convince the doctor that yes, you really did need that increased dose. You'd developed a skill for presenting yourself as someone who was struggling but not addicted. Someone who needed medical help rather than someone who'd become dependent on pharmaceutical methamphetamine. The dose increases came with escalating side effects. Higher doses meant more severe heart palpitations, worse insomnia, more intense paranoia, greater weight loss. But you'd learn to accept these as the price of functioning. A racing heart was better than crushing exhaustion. Paranoia was better than depression. Severe weight loss was actually viewed as a bonus. Some women reached a point where they were taking pills around the clock just to avoid withdrawal. They'd wake up multiple times during the night to take half a tablet, trying to maintain blood levels that would prevent the crash. Sleep became impossible, but staying awake on amphetamines was better than facing the withdrawal symptoms. The financial cost mounted too. Higher doses meant more pills, which meant more money. Some women would skip groceries or economize on household expenses to afford their prescriptions. Others would borrow money, make excuses to their husbands about where the money was going, or resort to increasingly desperate measures to fund their habit. And through it all, the doctors kept writing prescriptions. They'd express concern, warn about side effects, suggest maybe trying to reduce the dose, but when pressed, they'd ultimately write the prescription. Because what else could they do? The patient was clearly suffering. The medication helped, even if it was also causing problems. Cutting someone off abruptly seemed cruel. The medical establishment had created a monster. They'd prescribed powerful addictive stimulants to millions of women, created tolerance and dependency, then responded by prescribing higher doses rather than addressing the underlying problem. And the women caught in this cycle had no way out, no support system, no acknowledgement that what was happening to them was pharmaceutical dependency rather than personal weakness. The truly tragic part of this whole nightmare was that most husbands had absolutely no idea their wives were surviving on pharmaceutical-grade stimulants. They just came home to clean houses, hot dinners, and smiling wives, never once questioning how one human being could accomplish that much in a single day without some kind of chemical assistance. In the 1940s and 50s, gender roles were so rigidly defined that husbands and wives existed in largely separate spheres. Men went to work, came home, read the newspaper, and expected dinner on the table. What happened during the day? How that dinner got made? How the house got cleaned? How their wives were actually surviving remained a mystery they never thought to investigate. The typical husband would leave for work at 7:30 a.m., kiss his wife on the cheek, and not think about her again until he walked back through the door 12 hours later. What did she do all day? He had a vague idea: cooking, cleaning, caring for children. But the specifics were invisible to him. Domestic labor was women's work, and real men didn't concern themselves with such trivial matters. So when his wife greeted him at the door with a smile, the house immaculate, dinner ready, the children bathed and well-behaved, he simply accepted it as the natural order of things. This was what wives did. This was what he'd married her for. The question of how she managed it all never crossed his mind. If his wife seemed more energetic than usual, if she was chattering rapidly about her day, if her hands trembled slightly as she served dinner, if she'd lost noticeable weight, he might comment on it positively. "You seem to have more energy lately. That's good. You're looking slim. Have you been watching your figure?" These weren't questions. They were approvals. The warning signs that might have indicated amphetamine use, the rapid speech, the dilated pupils, the weight loss, the inability to sit still, the mood swings, were either invisible to him or interpreted as positive changes. His wife was more energetic, more productive, thinner, more cheerful. Why would he question that? Some wives tried to hide their pill-taking from their husbands, swallowing their morning dose in the bathroom or slipping pills into their mouths while making breakfast. This wasn't because their husbands had forbidden the medication. It was because discussing it felt shameful, weak, like admitting failure at the one job they were supposed to be able to do naturally. Other wives were more open about it, mentioning casually that the doctor had prescribed something for their exhaustion or nerves. Most husbands responded with mild approval. If a doctor prescribed it, it must be legitimate medicine. If it helped his wife manage the household better, even better. The thought that his wife might be developing a drug dependency never occurred to him. In some cases, husbands actively encourage their wives to take the medication. If a wife mentioned feeling tired or overwhelmed, a husband might suggest she see a doctor, knowing that the doctor would likely prescribe something to help her cope. This wasn't malicious. He genuinely thought he was being helpful. He wanted his wife to be happy, and if a pill could make that happen, why not? The separate spheres meant that husbands missed obvious signs of addiction. If his wife was taking pills every few hours, if she had multiple prescriptions from different doctors, if she panicked when she ran low on pills, he probably wouldn't notice because he wasn't paying attention to those details. They belonged to her world, not his. Even when wives experienced severe side effects, heart palpitations, paranoia, insomnia, dramatic weight loss, husbands often remained oblivious. These problems existed during the day. In the domestic sphere, where he wasn't present, by the time he came home in the evening, his wife had learned to mask her symptoms to present the version of herself he expected to see. The emotional distance in many marriages made communication about these issues nearly impossible. Wives didn't feel they could confess to their husbands that they were struggling, that they'd become dependent on pills, that they weren't sure how to stop. Such conversations would require vulnerability and intimacy that often didn't exist in these relationships. When marriages did include more partnership and communication, husbands still often failed to recognize the problem because the medical establishment had legitimized it. If doctors were prescribing these medications, if pharmacists were filling these prescriptions, if advertisements in respectable magazines promoted them, how could they be dangerous? The husband trusted the system, and the system said his wife needed medication. In rare cases where husbands did notice and express concern, they'd be reassured by their wives and doctors that everything was fine. It's just something to help with my energy levels. The doctor says it's perfectly safe. Lots of women are taking it. What could he say to that? He wasn't a medical expert. The true tragedy was that husbands could have been allies in recognizing and addressing the problem. But the gender dynamics of the era, combined with medical legitimization of amphetamine use, created a situation where wives suffered in isolation while their husbands remained completely unaware that anything was wrong. The man would go to work, return home to a perfectly maintained household, and never once wonder at the cost his wife was paying to maintain that perfection. He'd eat his dinner, play with his children, read his newspaper, and go to bed beside a woman who was quietly destroying herself to meet his expectations. And he'd sleep soundly, completely unaware of the pharmaceutical nightmare unfolding beside him. Benzodrine wasn't alone in the medicine cabinet of horrors. There was dexedrine, another amphetamine marketed for weight loss and depression. There was methedrine, literally methamphetamine, prescribed for everything from obesity to narcolepsy, to that vague sense that life had no meaning, which, spoiler alert, the meth didn't actually fix. The pharmaceutical landscape of the 1940s and 50s was a wild west of stimulants, each marketed with slightly different claims, but all delivering the same basic punch of artificial energy and chemical euphoria. Drug companies competed fiercely for market share, each claiming their formulation was superior, safer, or more effective than the competition. Dexedrine, manufactured by Smith, Kline, and French as a follow-up to benzodrine, was dextroamphetamine, essentially a more potent version of the same drug. The marketing positioned it as cleaner and more refined, with fewer side effects. This was mostly nonsense, but it sounded scientific enough to convince doctors and patients that this new pill was somehow better than the old pill, even though both were just different forms of amphetamine. Dexedrine was particularly marketed for weight loss. Advertisements showed glamorous women who'd achieved their ideal figures thanks to this modern approach to weight management. The dosing recommendations were shockingly high by today's standards, 10 to 30 milligrams per day, sometimes more. Women would take dexedrine, lose dramatic amounts of weight, develop severe insomnia and anxiety, then be prescribed barbiturates to counteract the stimulant effects, creating a pharmaceutical seesaw. Then there was desoxin, the brand name for methamphetamine hydrochloride. Yes, actual methamphetamine, the same drug that would later become infamous as a street drug and the subject of cautionary tales. In the 40s and 50s, it was prescribed medicine, available by prescription for obesity, depression, and narcolepsy. Desoxin was marketed as particularly effective for treatment-resistant cases. Patients who hadn't responded well to other medications. In reality, this often meant patients who developed such high tolerance to benzodrine or dexedrine that they needed something even stronger. Methamphetamine fit the bill perfectly, being significantly more potent than regular amphetamine. Doctors prescribed desoxin with the same casual confidence they applied to other amphetamines. 5 to 10 milligram tablets, taken once or twice daily, meant women were consuming pharmaceutical methamphetamine as part of their morning routine. The long-term effects, severe addiction, psychosis, cardiovascular damage, dental problems, wouldn't become widely recognized for years. Obertrol was another popular option, a combination of several different amphetamine salts marketed specifically for weight loss. The multi-drug approach was supposed to provide sustained appetite suppression throughout the day. In practice, it meant users were getting a cocktail of stimulants, each with slightly different onset times and durations, keeping them in a constant state of chemical stimulation. Biphetamine, or black beauties as they'd later be known on the street, combined amphetamine and dextroamphetamine in time-release capsules. These were supposed to provide steady energy throughout the day without peaks and crashes. They became wildly popular among housewives who needed all-day energy without having to remember multiple doses. The time-release formulation was actually more dangerous in some ways because it meant sustained exposure to high amphetamine levels. Users couldn't control the timing or intensity of the drug's effects. Once you swallowed the capsule, you were committed to 12 hours of stimulation whether you wanted it or not. There were also combination drugs like Dexamyl, which paired dexamphetamine with a barbiturate sedative. The marketing pitch was ingenious. The amphetamine would give you energy and elevate your mood, while the barbiturate would smooth out the jittery side effects and help you sleep at night. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turns out. Dexamyl users were essentially taking uppers and downers simultaneously, their bodies constantly being pushed in opposite directions. The drug became notoriously addictive, and withdrawal from both components simultaneously was brutal, but it was prescribed freely for anxiety with depression, a diagnosis that could describe virtually any woman struggling with the demands of 1950s domesticity. Some pharmaceutical companies got creative with their formulations. There were amphetamine barbiturate vitamin combinations, marketed as complete nutritional support for busy women. There were colored capsules, reds, blacks, greens, each promising slightly different effects but all containing essentially the same drugs. The variety gave an illusion of choice and customization. If benzodrine didn't work for you, try dexedrine. If that caused too many side effects, switch to desoxin. If you needed something for all-day energy, biphetamine. If you were anxious, Dexamyl. The pharmaceutical industry had created a product for every complaint, and doctors prescribed them interchangeably, often switching patients from one to another as tolerance developed or side effects emerged. What nobody acknowledged was that these weren't different solutions, they were variations on the same problem. Whether you called it benzodrine, dexedrine, desoxin, or obertrol, you were taking amphetamines. Whether it came in a white tablet, a colored capsule, or a time-release formulation, you were consuming powerful stimulants with high addiction potential and serious health risks. The medicine cabinet of the average housewife in the 1950s might contain 3 or 4 different amphetamine preparations, plus barbiturates for sleep, plus tranquilizers for anxiety, a pharmacological cocktail that would horrify modern physicians. But at the time, it was just modern medicine, just good doctoring, just helping women cope with the demands of their lives. The miracle drugs weren't miracles. They were legal methamphetamine in different packages, prescribed by trusted physicians, manufactured by reputable companies, and destroying lives one cheerful little tablet at a time. It wasn't just housewives getting prescribed amphetamines. Doctors also gave them to children for hyperactivity, which sounds suspiciously like giving cocaine to someone who's already bouncing off the walls. But hey, it was the 40s, and medical ethics were more of a suggestion than a rule. The practice of medicating children with amphetamines began in the 1930s and exploded in popularity through the 40s and 50s. The target was children who today might be diagnosed with ADHD, kids who couldn't sit still, couldn't focus, couldn't conform to the behavioral expectations of classrooms designed for perfect obedience and stillness. Teachers would notice a child having difficulty paying attention or sitting quietly through long periods of instruction, and would suggest to parents that something might be wrong with the child. Parents, concerned and wanting to help, would take their child to a physician. The doctor would observe the child's energetic behavior and diagnose hyperkinetic syndrome, minimal brain dysfunction, or simply hyperactivity. The prescribed treatment? The same amphetamines being given to their mothers, benzodrine, dextrine, or other stimulants, just in smaller doses adjusted for body weight. 5 milligrams for a 7-year-old, 10 milligrams for a 10-year-old. Children as young as 5 or 6 were being started on daily amphetamines. The medical logic seemed paradoxical on its surface, giving stimulants to children who were already overstimulated. But doctors had observed that amphetamines, in some children, had a calming effect. The kids would sit still, focus better, cause fewer disruptions in class. It seemed to work, so the prescriptions flowed. What doctors didn't fully understand at the time was the mechanism. Amphetamines don't calm children. They enhance focus and executive function in ways that allow better self-regulation. But they're still powerful stimulants affecting developing brains in ways that wouldn't be fully understood for decades. Children on amphetamines experience the same side effects as adults: appetite suppression, sleep difficulties, mood changes, and cardiovascular stress. But children couldn't always articulate what they were experiencing. A child wouldn't say, "I'm experiencing heart palpitations and anxiety." They'd just seem jittery, scared, or would complain their chest felt funny. The appetite suppression was particularly concerning in growing children. Kids on amphetamines would push away their meals, showing no interest in food. Parents and doctors would notice the weight loss and stunted growth, but often attributed it to the underlying condition rather than the medication. Some children remained significantly below normal height and weight throughout their treatment. Sleep became a battlefield in these households. Children would be given amphetamines in the morning to help them focus at school, then would be completely unable to sleep at night because they were still wired from the medication. Parents would struggle through bedtime battles with children whose bodies were chemically prevented from winding down. Some doctors prescribed barbiturates to help the children sleep, meaning these kids were on the same pharmaceutical seesaw as their mothers, taking uppers during the day and downers at night. The long-term effects of giving developing brains this chemical whiplash daily weren't studied or considered. The personality changes could be dramatic. Energetic, creative, exuberant children would become quiet, focused, and compliant. Parents and teachers often viewed this as improvement. The child was better behaved, easier to manage, doing better in school. Nobody asked whether chemically suppressing a child's natural personality and energy was actually healthy. Some children became emotionally flat on the medication. Their natural enthusiasm and joy dimmed along with their hyperactivity. They'd go through their days in a kind of pharmaceutical fog, focused enough to complete schoolwork, compliant enough to avoid punishment, but lacking the spark and vitality that had defined them before medication. The social implications were significant. Children on amphetamines often didn't eat lunch at school, which set them apart from peers. They might seem odd or different, too focused, too intense, lacking the natural playfulness of childhood. Other children would notice and sometimes ostracize the medicated kids. Parents faced impossible choices. On one hand, they had a child who was struggling in school, being labeled as a problem, falling behind academically, and facing punishment or expulsion. On the other hand, they had medication that seemed to help but came with concerning side effects. Most chose the medication because the alternative, a child who failed in school, seemed worse. The long-term impacts on these children wouldn't become clear for years. Some developed lasting relationships with stimulants, continuing to use them, legally or otherwise, into adulthood. Others struggled with addiction issues later in life, their brains having been shaped by amphetamine exposure during critical developmental periods. There were also diagnostic problems. In the 40s and 50s, hyperactivity was a catch-all diagnosis applied to children who were bored, under-challenged, experiencing trauma, dealing with learning disabilities, or just being normal, energetic kids in educational systems designed for conformity. Many children prescribed amphetamines probably didn't have any neurological condition. They were just children being children. The racial and class dimensions were significant too. White, middle-class children whose parents could afford doctors were more likely to be diagnosed and medicated. Poor children and children of color with similar behaviors were more likely to be simply labeled as bad and punished rather than treated. Looking back, it's clear that an entire generation of children was medicated with powerful stimulants based on limited understanding of both the conditions being treated and the long-term effects of the treatment. These children grew up on speed, their developing brains and bodies shaped by daily exposure to pharmaceutical amphetamines, all in the name of making them easier to manage in classrooms and homes. The practice would continue and even expand in later decades, but its roots were in the casual prescribing practices of the 40s and 50s, when doctors thought nothing of handing out amphetamines to anyone who couldn't sit still and behave, adult or child. Eventually, after months or years of daily amphetamine use, the cracks started showing. Weight loss became emaciation, energy became jitters, happiness became mania, and the housewife who'd started taking pet pills to get through her day now couldn't function without them, trapped in a cycle of dependency that her doctor had created and society had encouraged. The transition from helpful medication to obvious addiction was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, then suddenly undeniable. Women would look in the mirror one day and barely recognize themselves. The healthy weight loss had continued past slim, past thin, into gaunt. Cheekbones protruded sharply. Collarbones jutted out at angles. Arms looked skeletal, hands bony and trembling. The physical deterioration extended beyond weight. Hair became brittle and thin, sometimes falling out in clumps. Nails broke and split. Skin took on a grayish, unhealthy pallor. The constant state of overstimulation meant chronic dehydration. Lips were cracked, skin was dry, eyes sunken. Women who'd started taking amphetamines to look their best now looked hollowed out, aged beyond their years. The behavioral changes became impossible to hide. The carefully controlled persona, the cheerful housewife with endless energy, began to fracture. Mood swings intensified. Women would be manic and chattering one moment, then crash into tearful depression the next. The smallest frustrations would trigger explosive anger. A child spilling milk could provoke screaming rage, completely disproportionate to the incident. The paranoia that had started as a whisper became a roar. Women became convinced their neighbors were plotting against them, their husbands were having affairs, their children were lying to them. They'd check locks obsessively, count pills repeatedly, monitor every detail of their households with exhausting vigilance. The line between reasonable caution and irrational fear disappeared entirely. Sleep became a distant memory. Women would go days without real rest, maybe catching an hour or two of fitful unconsciousness before jerking awake, heart racing, mind spinning. The exhaustion accumulated like debt, and no amount of amphetamines could truly compensate for the sleep deficit. They'd walk through their days like zombies, eyes open, bodies moving, but consciousness barely present. The pill-taking itself became compulsive and chaotic. The carefully scheduled morning dose had evolved into pills taken every few hours, then every hour, then whenever the previous dose started to wear off. Women would count their remaining pills obsessively, panic if they had fewer than expected, hoard extras just in case. The medication that was supposed to organize their lives had created chaos. Doctor shopping became necessary to maintain the habit. A woman might have prescriptions from 3 or 4 different physicians, each one unaware of the others. She'd visit pharmacies in different neighborhoods, careful never to fill too many prescriptions at the same place. She'd become skilled at presenting herself as someone with a legitimate medical need rather than someone with a raging addiction. The financial strain became severe. Amphetamines weren't expensive individually, but when you're taking 10 or 20 pills a day instead of the prescribed 2, the costs mounted quickly. Women would hide money from their household budgets, make up excuses for missing funds, sometimes resort to stealing or selling possessions to afford their pills. Relationships deteriorated. Husbands who'd been oblivious began to notice that something was seriously wrong. Their wives were too thin, too agitated, too unpredictable. Children became wary of their mother's mood swings, learning to tiptoe around the house, never quite sure which version of their mother they'd encounter. Friendships faded as women became too paranoid or erratic to maintain social connections. Some women experienced complete psychotic breaks. They'd become convinced of elaborate conspiracies, see things that weren't there, hear voices telling them to do things. They'd show up at their doctor's offices or hospitals in states of complete disorientation, having lost touch with reality entirely. Most were diagnosed with schizophrenia or severe depression. The possibility that their symptoms were amphetamine-induced psychosis rarely occurred to medical professionals. The crashes between doses became catastrophic. When the pills wore off, women would plummet into depression so severe they couldn't get out of bed. Everything would seem hopeless, overwhelming, pointless. The thought of facing another day without pills was unbearable. So they'd take more pills, postponing the crash but making it inevitably worse when it finally came. Physical health problems multiplied. Heart palpitations became chest pain. High blood pressure became hypertensive crises. The constant state of sympathetic nervous system activation meant their bodies were perpetually in fight or flight mode, which takes a devastating toll over time. Some women had heart attacks or strokes in their 30s and 40s, their cardiovascular systems destroyed by years of amphetamine abuse. The dental problems emerged. Meth mouth wouldn't become a recognized phenomenon until much later, but women on long-term amphetamines experienced similar issues. Teeth would decay rapidly, sometimes crumbling or falling out. The combination of dry mouth, teeth grinding, poor nutrition, and neglected hygiene created perfect conditions for catastrophic dental deterioration. Yet even when the addiction became undeniable, many women couldn't stop. They'd tried quitting and experienced withdrawal so severe, crushing fatigue, suicidal depression, inability to function, that going back to the pills seemed like the only option. They were trapped, their bodies and minds completely dependent on a substance that was destroying them. The tragic irony was that they'd started taking these pills to help them function, to make them better wives and mothers, to meet the impossible standards society had set. And now the pills were the very thing preventing them from functioning, from being present for their families, from having any kind of normal life. The medicine had become the disease. What goes up must come down, and nowhere was this more true than with amphetamine use. When the drug wore off, usually in the evening, users experienced what's politely called a crash, but was actually crushing exhaustion, deep depression, irritability, and the overwhelming urge to either sleep for 3 days or take more pills to avoid feeling this way. The amphetamine crash wasn't like normal tiredness. It was a total systemic shutdown. like your body had spent all its energy reserves and then borrowed against tomorrow's reserves and then borrowed against next week's. When the drug finally metabolized out of your system, the bill came due all at once. It would start with a creeping sense of heaviness. Your limbs would begin to feel weighted down, like someone had attached sandbags to your arms and legs. The energy that had seemed limitless just hours before would drain away, leaving you hollow and exhausted in a way that felt almost existential. Your mood would plummet simultaneously. The chemical euphoria and confidence the amphetamines provided would vanish, and in its place would come crushing despair. Everything would seem hopeless. Problems that had seemed manageable while on the pills would loom enormous and unsolvable. The future would look bleak and empty. The physical sensations were deeply uncomfortable. Your body, having been in overdrive for 12 or 15 hours, would ache. Muscles would feel sore and tight, as if you'd run a marathon. Your jaw would hurt from hours of unconscious clenching. Your head would throb with a dull, persistent pain that seemed to emanate from behind your eyes. Mentally, the crash brought a kind of cognitive fog. Thoughts would move slowly, sluggishly, like trying to think through thick mud. Making even simple decisions would feel impossible. The sharp mental clarity the pills provided would be replaced by confusion and disorientation. The hunger would return with a vengeance. After hours or days of having no appetite, your body would suddenly demand food, lots of food. Women would find themselves eating compulsively during the crash, consuming whatever they could find in desperate attempts to refuel their depleted systems. But the food wouldn't help much. It couldn't replace what the amphetamines had taken. Emotionally, the crash made women fragile and volatile. They'd cry at nothing, explode in anger over trivial annoyances, feel overwhelmed by situations they'd normally handle easily. It was like all the emotions that had been suppressed or masked by the amphetamines came flooding back at once, amplified and uncontrollable. The worst part was the anhedonia, the complete inability to feel pleasure or joy. Things that normally brought happiness, your children's laughter, a beautiful sunset, your favorite food, would feel flat and meaningless. The world would seem drained of color, everything gray and pointless. This was your brain's reward system recalibrating after being artificially flooded with dopamine for hours. Sleep during the crash was supposed to be the body's recovery mechanism, but it rarely worked properly. You'd be desperately tired, but unable to actually fall asleep. Or you'd sleep but fitfully, plagued by vivid, disturbing dreams. When you did manage to sleep, you might stay unconscious for 12 or 14 hours, waking up groggy and disoriented. Having lost most of a day, the crash also brought anxiety and paranoia. Without the artificial confidence the amphetamines provided, all your fears and insecurities would resurface. You'd worry about everything: your health, your marriage, your children, your future. The paranoid thoughts that had been building while on the pills would intensify, becoming more vivid and harder to dismiss. For women trying to maintain households and care for families, the crash was catastrophic. Dinner wouldn't get made. Children would be neglected or snapped at. The house would fall into disarray. All the superhuman productivity of the amphetamine-fueled day would be undone by the crash-induced paralysis of evening. Many women learned to time their crashes for when their families were asleep. They'd push through dinner and bedtime routines on fading fumes of amphetamine, then collapse once everyone else was in bed. They'd spend the late evening and early morning hours in a state of miserable exhaustion, crying in darkened kitchens, eating compulsively, or just staring at walls in depression. Others would try to avoid the crash entirely by taking more pills. As the evening dose began to wear off, they'd swallow another tablet, then another, staying artificially elevated for 18 or 20 hours before the crash finally caught up with them. This meant even worse crashes when they finally came. The exhaustion and depression amplified by the extended period of stimulation. The crashes also became more severe over time. As tolerance developed and doses increased, the come-downs became proportionally worse. A woman who'd started on 5 milligrams of benzodrine and experienced mild tiredness when it wore off might, 2 years later, to be taking 50 milligrams and experiencing crashes that felt like complete physical and psychological collapse. Some women used alcohol to smooth out the crashes. They'd start drinking in the evening as the amphetamines wore off, hoping the alcohol would ease them down gently rather than letting them plummet. This created its own problems. The combination of stimulants and depressants put enormous strain on the body. And using one substance to moderate another is textbook addiction behavior. Others turned to barbiturates or other sedatives prescribed by doctors who either didn't know about or didn't care about the amphetamine use. These women would be on uppers all day, then switch to downers at night, their bodies never finding equilibrium, always being chemically pushed in one direction or another. The crash was a daily reminder that the pills weren't actually giving energy. They were stealing it from the future and charging interest. Every high would be paid for with a corresponding low. Every day of artificial capability would be balanced by hours of helpless exhaustion. The debt always came due, and it came due with interest that compounded daily. And yet, the crash also became the reason women couldn't quit. The thought of facing that crushing exhaustion and depression without the escape hatch of more pills was unbearable. So they'd endure the crash, hate themselves through it, suffer through it, and then wake up the next morning and take another pill to make it all go away. At least temporarily, until the next crash came. Before the pills took over, benzodrine was actually sold as an over-the-counter inhaler for nasal congestion, which people quickly realized could be cracked open and the amphetamine-soaked strip inside could be eaten for a powerful high. This was pharmaceutical methamphetamine you could buy at the corner drugstore without a prescription, because apparently the 40s were a lawless hellscape disguised as a wholesome decade. The benzodrine inhaler was introduced in 1932 by Smith, Kline, and French as a treatment for nasal congestion, hay fever, and asthma. The device was simple: a plastic tube containing a cotton or paper strip soaked in amphetamine. You'd crack it open, inhale through your nostrils, and the volatile amphetamine vapors would constrict your blood vessels, opening your airways. For its intended purpose, it worked reasonably well. People with clogged sinuses or asthma found relief. The company marketed it as a safe, effective alternative to other decongestants. And because it was for breathing problems rather than mental health or weight loss, it was sold over the counter. No prescription needed. Just walk into any drugstore and buy as many as you wanted. It didn't take long for people to figure out the hack. College students, truck drivers, and night shift workers discovered that if you cracked open the inhaler and removed the amphetamine-soaked strip, you could eat it and get an intense stimulant high. Each inhaler contained about 250 milligrams of amphetamine, enough to keep someone wired for a full day and night. The practice spread rapidly through word of mouth. By the late 30s and early 40s, eating bennies, breaking open benzodrine inhalers, and consuming the strips had become common among students cramming for exams, workers needing to stay alert, and anyone looking for a cheap, legal high. The method was crude but effective. You'd unscrew the cap, pull out the accordion-folded paper strip dripping with liquid amphetamine, and either eat it directly or cut it into smaller pieces to dose throughout the day. The taste was reportedly awful, bitter, chemical, burning, but the high was worth the unpleasantness. Some users would soak the strips in coffee or other beverages to mask the taste. Others would dry them out and swallow them like pills. The more sophisticated would use the inhalers as intended multiple times throughout the day, getting smaller doses of amphetamine through nasal inhalation, which also delivered the drug effectively, if less dramatically than eating the strip. The inhalers became particularly popular during World War II. Soldiers would purchase them before deployment or receive them in care packages from home. Officially, they were for respiratory relief in various climates and conditions. Unofficially, they were portable speed that could keep soldiers alert during long watches or combat situations. Factory workers on the home front used them too. The war economy demanded round-the-clock production, with workers pulling double shifts in munitions factories, shipyards, and aircraft plants. Benzodrine inhalers helped them stay awake and productive, maintaining the grueling pace that wartime production demanded. Housewives discovered them as well. A woman who couldn't or wouldn't ask her doctor for amphetamine pills could simply buy inhalers at the drugstore, ostensibly for seasonal allergies or sinus problems. Nobody questioned it. If someone bought 5 or 6 inhalers at once, the pharmacist might assume she had bad allergies or was stocking up. The inhalers were cheap, usually less than $1 each, making them accessible even to people who couldn't afford doctor visits and prescriptions. This democratized amphetamine access in ways that made it even more widespread. You didn't need medical approval or pharmaceutical connections, just pocket change and a drugstore. The risks of inhaler abuse were significant but poorly understood at the time. The doses people consumed by eating the strips were enormous compared to therapeutic doses. 250 milligrams of amphetamine is roughly 50 times a standard medical dose. People were essentially overdosing deliberately, multiple times per week, or even per day. The method of consumption also mattered. Eating the strip meant the amphetamine was absorbed through the digestive system, leading to a slower onset but longer duration than snorting or injection. Users would feel the effects building over 30 to 60 minutes, then sustaining for many hours. This made it harder to control the intensity of the high and easier to accidentally take too much. Some users experienced severe adverse effects. Heart palpitations, hypertension, hypothermia, seizures, and psychotic episodes were all documented among inhaler abusers. Emergency rooms began seeing patients who'd eaten benzodrine strips and were experiencing medical crises. But because the inhalers were legal and over-the-counter, many people didn't connect their symptoms to drug abuse. The authorities were slow to respond. The inhalers were marketed for legitimate medical purposes and were popular products. Smith, Klein, and French resisted changes that might hurt sales. It wasn't until the late 1940s that mounting evidence of abuse led to regulatory action. In 1949, the FDA finally required that benzodrine inhalers be labeled with warnings against improper use and that the amphetamine content be reduced. By the late 50s, the product had been reformulated to contain propylhexadrine instead of amphetamine, a different stimulant with less abuse potential. But by then, millions of people had had easy access to massive doses of pharmaceutical amphetamine for nearly 2 decades. An entire generation had grown up with speed available at corner drugstores. No questions asked, no medical supervision required. The benzodrine inhaler had been the gateway that normalized amphetamine use and made it seem safe, ordinary, and American. The irony was that the inhaler was supposed to help people breathe easier. Instead, it helped them discover that powerful stimulants were readily available, easily abused, and that the line between medicine and recreational drug was frighteningly thin. It was pharmaceutical methamphetamine in the truest sense. Powerful, addictive, and sold with a friendly smile at your local drugstore. It took until the 1950s for doctors to start noticing that maybe, just maybe, prescribing addictive stimulants to already vulnerable women was causing more problems than it solved. Reports of addiction, psychosis, and cardiovascular problems started piling up, and slowly, reluctantly, the medical community began questioning whether speed was really the answer to sadness. The recognition that amphetamines were dangerous didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual accumulation of evidence that even the most enthusiastic prescribers couldn't ignore forever. Medical journals began publishing case studies of patients experiencing severe side effects, addiction, and psychiatric crises clearly linked to amphetamine use. By the early 1950s, emergency rooms were seeing regular admissions for amphetamine-related problems. Heart attacks in young women, psychotic breaks in previously healthy patients, overdoses, both accidental and intentional. The pattern was undeniable, even to physicians who'd been happily writing prescriptions for years. Researchers began conducting studies on long-term amphetamine use and finding concerning results. Tolerance developed rapidly. Physical dependency was common. Withdrawal symptoms were severe. The medications that had been promoted as safe and non-addictive were, in fact, highly addictive and potentially dangerous. The pharmaceutical companies fought back against this emerging consensus. They funded their own studies, showing amphetamines were safe when properly used. They emphasized the benefits while downplaying the risks. They argued that problems arose from patient misuse rather than inherent drug dangers. Their marketing budgets were enormous, and they used them to influence medical opinion and protect their profitable products. Some doctors changed their prescribing practices in response to the emerging evidence. They became more cautious, more selective, prescribed lower doses for shorter periods. They started actually monitoring their patients for signs of dependency and addiction. They began considering non-pharmaceutical alternatives for depression and fatigue. But many doctors resisted change. They'd been prescribing amphetamines for years, sometimes decades. Their patients seemed to benefit. The alternative treatments, rest, therapy, social support, were impractical or unavailable for most women. What were they supposed to do? Tell their exhausted patients to just try harder? The medical community was also slow to acknowledge its own role in creating the problem. Doctors had been the ones writing millions of prescriptions. They'd ignored early warning signs. They'd increased doses rather than questioning dependency. They'd added more medications to counteract side effects rather than stopping the problematic drugs. Admitting that amphetamines were dangerous meant admitting they'd harmed their patients, and that was a difficult pill to swallow. Professional organizations began issuing guidelines recommending more careful prescribing. The American Medical Association warned about amphetamine abuse in the mid-50s. Medical schools started teaching about addiction and dependency. But these changes filtered down slowly to practicing physicians, many of whom continued prescribing as they always had. The psychiatric community was particularly divided. Some psychiatrists recognized that amphetamines could trigger or worsen mental health problems. Others argued that the drugs were valuable tools for treating depression and should continue to be used despite the risks. The debate played out in journals, conferences, and academic institutions while patients continued suffering. A few physicians became vocal critics of amphetamine overprescription. They published articles, gave lectures, and warned colleagues about the dangers they were seeing. These voices were often dismissed as alarmist or overly cautious. The prevailing attitude was that problems occurred in a small minority of patients and didn't justify restricting access for the majority who benefited. The recognition of amphetamine psychosis was particularly important. Psychiatrists began documenting cases of patients with no history of mental illness who developed severe paranoia, hallucinations, and delusions after prolonged amphetamine use, and whose symptoms resolved after stopping the medication. This established a clear causal link that couldn't be explained away. Research on cardiovascular effects also accumulated. Studies showed that chronic amphetamine use led to elevated blood pressure, irregular heartbeats, and increased risk of heart attack and stroke. Young women were having cardiac events at rates that should have been statistically impossible, and amphetamines were the common factor. The weight loss industry was particularly resistant to change. Even as evidence mounted about amphetamine dangers, diet doctors continued prescribing them liberally. The demand was too high, the results too dramatic, the profits too substantial. Diet pills remained a booming business despite growing awareness of their risks. By the late 1950s, there was enough evidence that even the most stubborn defenders of amphetamines had to acknowledge problems existed. But acknowledgement didn't translate into effective action. Prescriptions remained common. Pharmaceutical companies continued marketing aggressively. Patients continued becoming addicted. The medical community's response was half-hearted and inconsistent. Some drugs were reformulated, some warnings were added to labels, some prescribing restrictions were implemented, but none of it was sufficient to address the scale of the problem that decades of overprescription had created. It would take another 2 decades and explicit federal regulation before amphetamine prescribing was truly curtailed. The medical community had caught on that there was a problem. But catching on and actually doing something about it turned out to be very different things. Of course, the drug companies weren't about to let their billion-dollar industry die without a fight. They launched campaigns insisting amphetamines were safe when properly prescribed, which was hilarious considering doctors were handing them out like breath mints to anyone who admitted to feeling tired or sad, which described literally every housewife in America. The pharmaceutical industry in the 1950s was powerful, profitable, and deeply invested in protecting amphetamine sales. These drugs generated enormous revenue, millions of prescriptions annually, each one representing profit for manufacturers, distributors, and pharmacies. The companies had no intention of watching that revenue stream disappear without a fight. Their first strategy was to reframe the narrative. Yes, some patients experienced problems with amphetamines, but that was due to misuse, not the medications themselves. The drugs were perfectly safe when used as directed, which ignored the reality that as directed often meant taking them daily for months or years, a pattern guaranteed to cause dependence. The pharmaceutical companies produced their own studies showing amphetamines were safe and effective. These studies were carefully designed to minimize apparent risks. Short-term trials wouldn't capture long-term addiction problems. Exclusion criteria would screen out patients most likely to experience side effects. Results would emphasize benefits while burying adverse events in footnotes. They also funded continuing medical education for physicians. These programs, ostensibly designed to keep doctors current on medical advances, were actually sophisticated marketing operations. Doctors would attend conferences, all expenses paid, where they'd hear presentations about the benefits of amphetamines from speakers with financial ties to pharmaceutical companies. The companies cultivated relationships with influential physicians, opinion leaders who could shape their colleagues' prescribing habits. These doctors received speaking fees, consulting contracts, and research funding. In exchange, they'd publish articles, give presentations, and generally advocate for continued amphetamine use. Advertising remained aggressive. Medical journals were filled with colorful ads, showing happy, energetic women who'd been helped by amphetamines. The imagery was always positive: smiling mothers, productive housewives, women who'd overcome their nervous exhaustion and returned to joyful domesticity. The side effects, addiction risks, and withdrawal symptoms were mentioned only in small print, if at all. The companies also lobbied aggressively against regulatory changes. When the FDA considered tightening restrictions on amphetamine prescribing, pharmaceutical industry representatives would argue that this would harm patients who legitimately needed the medications. They'd present emotional testimonials from patients whose lives had supposedly been saved by amphetamines. They worked to shape medical language and diagnostic criteria. The industry helped define conditions like nervous exhaustion, mild depression, and fatigue states. Vague diagnoses that could apply to almost anyone and for which amphetamines were the recommended treatment. By medicalizing normal human responses to difficult circumstances, they expanded the market for their products. When evidence of addiction became undeniable, the companies introduced new formulations marketed as safer or less addictive. Time-release capsules. Combination drugs with added vitamins or sedatives. Lower dose options. These weren't actually safer. They were the same addictive drugs in different packaging, but they allowed companies to claim they'd addressed concerns while maintaining sales. The industry also played different regulatory agencies against each other. If the FDA became more restrictive, companies would emphasize that other countries still approved their drugs. If one agency questioned safety, they'd cite approval from another as evidence of legitimacy. They created a maze of regulations that was difficult to navigate and easy to exploit. Pharmaceutical representatives, detail men, as they were called, visited doctors' offices regularly, bringing free samples, promotional materials, and sometimes gifts. These reps were trained to emphasize benefits, minimize risks, and encourage prescribing. A doctor who expressed concerns about amphetamines would be assured that problems were rare and manageable. The companies funded patient advocacy groups that would lobby for continued access to medications. These groups, often led by genuine patients who'd benefited from treatment, would argue against restrictions as interference with medical practice and patient choice. The pharmaceutical funding behind these organizations was rarely disclosed. When studies showed concerning results, the industry would attack the methodology, question the researchers' credentials, or fund counter-studies with more favorable results. They'd emphasize uncertainty and debate, arguing that the science wasn't settled enough to justify restricting access to helpful medications. The legal department worked overtime too. When patients sued over addiction or side effects, companies would settle quietly with non-disclosure agreements, preventing cases from becoming public warnings. They'd use every legal maneuver to delay, deflect, and minimize liability. The industry also cultivated relationships with medical schools and teaching hospitals. Donations would fund research facilities, endow professorships, and support medical education. In return, the companies gained influence over what future doctors would learn about pharmacology and prescribing practices. Perhaps most cynically, when the dangers of amphetamines became too obvious to deny, the pharmaceutical companies simply developed new drugs to address the problems caused by the old ones. Addicted to amphetamines? Try our new tranquilizer. Having trouble sleeping? We have a barbiturate for that. Experiencing anxiety? Here's a new medication that might help. They turned the crisis they'd created into a new profit opportunity. The same companies that had made billions selling amphetamines would make billions more selling drugs to manage amphetamine addiction, then billions more selling drugs to manage addiction to those drugs. It was a pharmaceutical perpetual motion machine powered by human suffering. The industry's resistance to regulation was so effective that meaningful restrictions on amphetamine prescribing wouldn't come until the 1970s, nearly 2 decades after the dangers became clear. Millions of people would develop dependencies, experience serious health problems, and have their lives disrupted in that interim, all while pharmaceutical companies fought to protect their profits. The fight wasn't about patient safety or scientific evidence. It was about money, pure and simple. And the pharmaceutical industry was very, very good at making sure their financial interests were protected, even when it meant keeping dangerous drugs available to vulnerable patients. By the 1960s, amphetamine use had shifted from prescription medicine to counterculture drug, from housewife helper to hippie fuel. The same pills that doctors had been prescribing to suburban mothers were now being taken by college students, truck drivers, and anyone looking for artificial energy and chemical euphoria, because apparently America had learned absolutely nothing from the previous 2 decades. The transformation of amphetamines from respectable medicine to counterculture drug was gradual but profound. What had been a middle-class suburban phenomenon in the 40s and 50s spread across social boundaries in the 60s, reaching into college campuses, artistic communities, working-class occupations, and eventually the street drug scene. College students discovered amphetamines in a big way during the 1960s. The academic pressure of university combined with the social upheaval of the era created perfect conditions for stimulant use. Students would take amphetamines to study for exams, write papers, stay awake for all-night cramming sessions. What their mothers had taken to clean houses, they took to maintain grade point averages. The pills circulated freely on campuses. Students would share medications, buy them from classmates who had prescriptions, or visit sympathetic doctors near campus who'd write prescriptions with minimal questioning. Some enterprising students would fake symptoms to multiple doctors, accumulating stockpiles to sell or trade. The artistic and intellectual communities embraced amphetamines as creative fuel. Writers, musicians, and artists used them to sustain long periods of focused work. The Beat generation had already popularized benzodrine use in the 50s. Jack Kerouac famously wrote parts of On the Road during amphetamine-fueled marathons. By the 60s, this practice had spread more widely. Truck drivers became notorious amphetamine users. Long-haul trucking demanded drivers stay awake for dangerous stretches of time, and amphetamines provided the artificial alertness to meet delivery schedules. Truck driver speed became slang for amphetamines, and roadside diners and truck stops were known places to obtain them. The military continued using amphetamines extensively. During the Vietnam War, American soldiers were issued amphetamines to maintain alertness during long patrols and combat operations. The drugs that had helped housewives get through their days were now helping soldiers get through guerrilla warfare in Southeast Asian jungles. The counterculture movement had a complicated relationship with amphetamines. While psychedelics like LSD and marijuana were embraced as consciousness-expanding and anti-establishment, amphetamines had a more ambiguous status. They were pharmaceutical, associated with the straight world, yet also provided intense experiences and helped sustain the all-night music and party scenes. Rock and roll culture became deeply intertwined with amphetamine use. Musicians used them to power through grueling tour schedules and marathon recording sessions. The Beatles, Rolling Stones, and countless other bands of the era had well-documented relationships with various forms of speed. The music itself sometimes reflected the jittery energy and rapid-fire intensity of amphetamine highs. The sexual revolution intersected with amphetamine use too. The pills suppressed appetite but heightened other drives and could extend sexual activity for hours. Combined with the relaxed social mores of the 60s, this made amphetamines popular in certain social and sexual scenes. Methamphetamine specifically began appearing as a street drug in the 60s, particularly in California. While pharmaceutical amphetamines remained available by prescription, underground chemists started producing methamphetamine illegally, offering higher potency and lower prices than legal sources. This was the beginning of the meth problem that would explode in later decades. The terminology shifted too. Pills that had been called pep pills or diet pills or bennies acquired new slang names. Speed, uppers, black beauties, white crosses, crank. The new language reflected new contexts. These weren't medicine anymore, they were drugs, with all the cultural connotations that implied. Law enforcement and public health officials struggled to respond. The same substances that had been considered legitimate medicine just years earlier were now being framed as dangerous drugs of abuse. But how do you crack down on medications that millions of Americans had been taking with their doctor's blessing? The cultural perception of who used amphetamines changed dramatically. In the 50s, users were respectable housewives following doctors' orders. By the late 60s, users included hippies, bikers, artists, and criminals. The drugs hadn't changed, but their social meaning had completely transformed. This shift created strange contradictions. A middle-aged woman could still visit her doctor and receive a prescription for dexedrine for weight loss or depression, perfectly legal, socially acceptable. Meanwhile, a college student taking the exact same drug would be viewed as engaging in drug abuse. Same chemical, completely different cultural framework. The 60s also saw the emergence of the phrase speed kills, coined as a warning about methamphetamine dangers. Anti-drug campaigns featured lurid images of gaunt, twitching speed freaks, imagery that would have seemed bizarre just a decade earlier. when similar drugs were being advertised in women's magazines. Yet, despite growing awareness of dangers, prescription amphetamine use remained widespread. The pills that fueled the 50s housewife continued fueling 60s America, just in new contexts and under new names. The cultural shift hadn't eliminated the problem, it had multiplied and diversified it. By the end of the decade, amphetamines occupied a strange cultural position. They were simultaneously prescription medication and street drug, housewife helper and hippie fuel, legitimate medicine and dangerous narcotic. America still hadn't figured out what these pills really were, or how to deal with them. The only thing that had become clear was that whatever promise amphetamines had initially offered, energy, happiness, productivity, came with costs that society was still calculating. So tonight, as you drift off in your comfortable bed, maybe take a moment to appreciate that your doctor isn't prescribing you methamphetamine for being tired. That exhaustion is recognized as a reasonable response to overwork rather than a character defect requiring pharmaceutical intervention. That the pills in your medicine cabinet come with warnings, regulations, and at least some attempt at oversight. The women of the 1940s and 50s didn't have those protections. They walked into doctors' offices exhausted and overwhelmed, and they walked out with bottles of pharmaceutical speed. They were told these pills would help them be better wives, better mothers, better women. Instead, they got addiction, health problems, and decades of suffering that nobody wanted to acknowledge or address. Their story isn't just about bad medicine or corporate greed or regulatory failure, though it's certainly all of those things. It's about what happens when we treat human suffering as a problem to be medicated rather than understood. When we ask individuals to chemically adapt to impossible circumstances rather than changing those circumstances. When we value productivity over well-being and compliance over health, these women survived impossible standards with artificial energy and chemical smiles. They paid the price with their health, their sanity, and sometimes their lives. And for decades, their suffering was invisible, buried under shame and silence, dismissed as personal weakness rather than recognized as systemic failure. But their legacy matters. It reminds us that medical solutions to social problems often create more suffering than they solve. That vulnerability can be exploited even with the best intentions. That what we call medicine and what we call drugs often depends more on marketing than chemistry. So rest easy tonight, knowing that the path from exhaustion to addiction isn't quite as smooth and doctor-approved as it once was. And maybe, just maybe, spare a thought for the housewives who ran on speed, smiled through the exhaustion, and paid a price we're still calculating, because history may be full of pharmaceutical nightmares. But it's also proof that we can learn, change, and do better, even if it takes us far too long to figure it out. Sweet dreams.